It's a strange world we live in, one which, at least once a year, we go out of our way to celebrate a vast array of terrors. The visions which haunt our dreams, the primordial creatures which go bump in the night. We flock to scary movies and pumpkin patch rides, we seek the thrill of horror novels or delve into creepy video games. But have you ever thought about why? Why are we so fascinated with horror, and how deep does this fascination with the diabolic go? Well, there's no better time to talk about it than Halloween, and there's no better author to start with than the grandfather of the modern horror genre himself. So today, let's talk about HP Lovecraft and the psychology of horror. As always, this video is brought to you by our patrons. To get access to ad-free content, vote on future video topics, or simply support this channel, check out the link in the description down below. As an author, I've become fascinated with the genre of horror, specifically gothic horror. So many of the modern books and films which come out today are such, shallow explorations of excessive violence, just full of shock value and jump scares. But if you look back at the tradition of horror in both literature and film, there's a strangely solemn element to the works, a deeper philosophical impact buried within. So, as a way to celebrate the Halloween season, in fact, by the time this video comes out, to celebrate Halloween itself, I wanted to analyze the genre of horror from a storytelling perspective. Because when attempting to create a quality piece of horror fiction, one of the first questions that comes to mind is, what makes a good horror story? Well, I suppose the simple answer is fear, which is where we get to the more fundamental question of this video, the psychology of horror. What makes us afraid, and why? To start, I want to go back to the beginning and look at where such stories began. The horror genre is one with ancient origins, going back to the stories of the Greeks and Romans. The idea of horror itself is steeped in a sort of dark mythos, stemming from religious beliefs and superstitions, often giving a face or form to the greatest perceived evils of a given culture. And one of the earliest appearances of such stories is the tale of Athenadoros Canaanites, a philosopher from Athens who, pleased at the low price, buys an abandoned house, only to suffer torment at the hands of its ghosts. The list of seminal works can be roughly tracked from there. Works like the Book of Revelations, the Inferno, the Gothic horror of the 18th and 19th century, Dracula, Frankenstein, and the works of Edgar Allen Poe. But one of the first authors to approach horror like a real literary genre, not simply pulp fiction or folk tales, was HP Lovecraft. And while he was largely unknown in his time, his influence formed the framework for the fully fledged genre that we enjoy today. Not only did Lovecraft write horror, mentor other horror authors of his time, and even loan out his intellectual property, which was largely unheard of for the time, he also was one of the first people to write about the horror genre itself. In his essay, Supernatural Horror and Literature, he discusses the components of the genre and the source of fear itself. Children will always be afraid of the dark, and men with minds sensitive to hereditary impulse will always tremble at the thought of hidden and fathomless worlds of strange life which may pulsate in the gulfs beyond the stars. Fear of the unknown. That is what Lovecraft wrote about, what he obsessed about. And if you look at all the various types of horror, all the subgenres, they all stem from this simple concept. It's the common element from which all fear stems. It's what makes us shrink from death and the dimly lit closet alike. Sure, this is a descriptor, but if you want to write horror or even understand how to elicit such a response, you have to understand the why behind the what. What makes cosmicism so terrifying? When we're afraid, the amygdala, which is essentially the fear center of the brain, becomes very active and triggers a series of physical responses, like increased heart rate and a release of adrenaline throughout the body. In an interview for BBC's Science Focus, Professor Joan Carter focused on this phenomenon. She had spent the last decade exploring, specifically, how films scare us and produce a lasting effect long after we've left the cinema. Dr. Cantor cited 3 recurring themes: disturbing visuals, imminent threat, and a lack of control. She also said that filmmakers like Hitchcock injected threat into the most benign places, like a shower. He knew that suspense, the promise of threat, would keep our fight or flight response going, drawing out that uncomfortable experience of being afraid. This drawing out becomes a moment of tension, ignoring the bounds of temporal reality and leaving the audience in a moment of sustained expectation. This expectation is simply another unknown, an unknown consequence, an unknown danger, or at the very least, fear fueled by the unknown. Now, Lovecraft described cosmic horror as something which induces reactions of awe and ineffable dread in his audiences. And philosophically, this brings to mind an interesting connection. Edmund Burke, in a publication from 1757, posited that the aesthetics of the sublime possess a quality of greatness that inspires awe and wonder, which would mean that cosmic fear, the most fundamental kind, is horror of the sublime. Horror which partakes of majesty. According to Burke, aspects which constitute sublimity are broken into three main pillars: a use of darkness, obscurity, and mystery, a vastness and magnitude, and the power of a strong emotion, often terror. Not only do these aspects line up with Lovecraft's work and the general concept of the horror genre, they can actually act as a guidebook to it, taking what we understand as psychologically terrifying and transforming them into more tangible storytelling concepts. Take a look at one of Lovecraft's most famous works, The Call of Cthulhu. In it, we follow the character of Francis Wayland Thurston as he goes through the letters of his dead uncle. As he delves deeper into these texts, he discovers talk of a cult. Already, there is an element of darkness and obscurity, carrying the mysterious stigma that all hidden and pathologically loyal organizations carry with them. As the story goes on, we find out that the cult worships an entity, a creature which is a strange combination of a dragon and an octopus, and inhabits the sunken city of Ryla. Here is a clear example of vastness, both in the scope of the cult and in the creature they worship, and which we later find out the actual size of the creature itself. After Thurston finishes reading the letters, he finally realizes that he too is the target of Cthulhu, ending the story on the sort of morbid cliffhangers with which all great horror stories conclude. This ending finalizes the story's incorporation of the sublime, leaving the narrator, and therefore the reader, in not only a state of fear but personal threat. For if Cthulhu comes for Thurston, he could next come for you. Horror is a unique genre. On its surface, it seems as though it would do more damage to its consumers than good, but in reality, the opposite is actually true. But what I find most interesting is the commonality of the fear of the unknown and a sort of strange nihilism. It's inherent to humans, seeming to exist in direct opposition to the idea of God and a benign creator, as if, perhaps, the greatest comfort would be an all-loving being, and the greatest terror would be an unloving one, a cold world, whose sheer scale drives us to madness, and perhaps this concept already has. Perhaps that's what a good horror story really is. A little piece of madness locked in a page. But these are just my thoughts and opinions on the matter. I would love to hear what you guys think about this whole video in the comments down below. I mean, do you like Lovecraft? Do you not? What do you think makes a good horror story? Please feel free to check out the Patreon link down below to support the channel and get access to ad-free content, behind the scenes, voting on future video topics, and so much more. And no matter what you do, always remember, keep reading, keep writing, and I will see you all in the next video.